Right then, let's have a look at the rest of Chapter 7 of The Great Gatsby and all the good quotations in it. So, the first one that I'm going to point out is this one. He looked and said, and this is said in all contempt for the babbled slander of his garden, as if he had killed a man. And so this is a really nice bit of evidence for narrative and narrative voice, because Nick is putting something in parentheses for us here, or Fitzgerald is anyway. And he's saying basically, I know about all the rumours and all the gossip that used to go on in Gatsby's party, and I understand that, but this is something that we need to take seriously. It's basically saying that he actually looked like he killed a man, not the ridiculous rumours from earlier. He actually does this time. So the idea that he puts it in parentheses, these dashes here for us, tells us that we need to take this seriously. There is a real difference in Gatsby, and he looks horrible at the moment. He looks like he's actually killed somebody. And I suggested that he might have killed somebody, or maybe he might have killed James Gatz, or he might have killed Jay Gatsby. Maybe his past self is the thing that's died, or maybe his facade has died, basically. Both are up for discussion, so it could be either one of them. Later on then, we have the Queensboro Bridge quote. So earlier on in the novel, we're introduced to this naive Nick driving with Gatsby into New York, and everything is optimistic, and you can see this in this quotation. So the city scene from the Queensboro Bridge is always a city seen for the first time, in its first wild promise of all the mystery and the beauty in the world. And this is when he's entering into New York, and it's really like positive imagery, and there's lots of promise, the wild promise basically, and mystery. However, this time he's going home, and this time it's actually coming away from New York, and so it's really full of pessimism. So as we passed over the dark bridge, her wan face fell lazily against my coat's shoulder, and the formidable stroke of 30 died away with the reassuring pressure of her hand. So we drove on towards death and the cooling twilight. So there's a real contrast between the earlier imagery, this really positive world that he's describing, and this really pessimistic one later on in this chapter. So I said it's an ominous sense of foreboding or foreshadowing here. Towards death tells us that, well, is this going to be towards his own death, or is this going to be some kind of disaster that we're approaching? And so probably we're foreshadowing the death of Myrtle here. So one's really sinister, one's really positive, and I'm saying that maybe Fitzgerald narrator is just becoming more cynical and less naive at this part in the novel. So later we come to George Wilson, and we've got the quotation, George Wilson's sick in his office, really sick, pale as his own pale hair and shaking all over. And then at the same time, when anyone spoke to him, he invariably laughed in an agreeable, colourless way. He was his wife's man and not his own. So I've got a lexical field of sicknesses used to describe Wilson. The idea that he's pale and that he's colourless says that there's no colour in him, basically, and he doesn't look healthy, he doesn't look right. And it also contrasts nicely to his wife. He lacks colour, she has plenty of it. So in contrast to her, he's really quite ghostly. He fits into the Valley of Ashes really well. She certainly doesn't. The interesting thing about here as well, he was his wife's man, these possessive pronouns here, which is really kind of curious. So I've said that in a patriarchal society, the fact that he was his wife's man, he belonged to her, is kind of interesting. It kind of presents him in this weak light, that he isn't as strong a man as other people in the character, especially Tom. Later on then we have this bit, so we've got Maverick Michaelis wasn't even sure of its colour, and this is post Myrtle's death, and this is the Greek store owner next door to Wilson, and he says he told the first policeman that it was a light green. It's interesting that Michaelis uses green, because green has gone from hope with the green light at the end of Daisy's dock to now kind of this despairing kind of colour. And Gatsby's car is cream, but the idea of actually saying that it was light green to start off with shows basically the death of this hope, how hope has changed into something that is much more sinister. So I think that's interesting in this quotation. And then the sinister part of it is this bit. So Myrtle Wilson, her life violently extinguished, knelt in the road and mingled her thick dark blood with the dust. So earlier you've got the idea that Myrtle literally smoulders, and so she's kind of like on fire. She contrasts with the people of the Valley of Ashes. Well, now look at her. Her thick dark blood with the dust. It mingles. So in this case, she's returning to that dust, returning to that ashes, and now she certainly fits in. And so the idea that Fitzgerald is telling us that you cannot escape your birth in the Great Gatsby. You absolutely can't. She was born ashes and she will die ashes, or she was born in the lower class and she will certainly die in the lower class too. There is no hope of achievement or advancement basically for her. It's always going to be that way. In this part then, I've got a mumbled incoherent remark to the policeman, and MAV, the policeman was saying, "Oh no, R," corrected the man, MAVRO. And so what I've suggested here is that this is Fitzgerald slowing down the narrative, and it heightens the tension. So obviously we just had Myrtle die, and what Fitzgerald wants to do is just slow the narrative down. And by having like a letter by letter part of the narrative, it really just slows the whole thing down to create this tension. We want to know what's going to happen, and Maverick Mikhail is spelling out his name, is just prolonging this for us. So it's an interesting narrative technique that he's using here. Later on then, we've got this part. Gatsby stepped from between two bushes. I could think of nothing except the luminosity of his pink suit under the moon. And so this word here is kind of interesting. Luminosity, it tells us that there's something tragic, something eccentric, and something pitiful about his pink suit. It was eccentric, it was mysterious, it was fantastic, but quite clearly now it does not fit into this old money upper class world. It's really kind of absurd, and maybe Gatsby is becoming a figure of ridicule and something that is just not quite right in this 1920s old money upper class society. Moving on then, we've got this representation of Tom and Daisy. It says, "They weren't happy, and neither of them had touched the chicken or the ale, and yet they weren't unhappy either. There was an unmistakable air of natural intimacy about the picture, and anybody would have said they were conspiring together." So the idea is that they weren't happy or unhappy, they just exist together. There's no meaning to their life, they just go around and do whatever they like, and there's no emotion invested in any of it, which is kind of pitiful and tragic. And then the idea here as well of them conspiring, that has heavy connotations basically of something negative, some kind of plotting or scheming together, which says that in this case Tom and Daisy, they're probably trying to figure out a way of how to come out of this without any consequences. And so I'm suggesting that at this point Daisy switched her loyalties and she's going back to Tom. There's no question about it here, certainly. And the final quotation then that I picked out was this one: "Turned back eagerly to his scrutiny of the house, as though my presence marred the sacredness of the vigil. So I walked away and left him there, standing in the moonlight, watching over nothing." So I found it interesting that it's called the sacredness of the vigil. It's something like religious, basically. There's a religious fervour to his actions, and so we can see just how desperate and passionate Gatsby is in this language here. And then at the same time, watching over nothing. I've said that Nick appreciates the futility of the situation, basically. Gatsby's looking out for something that's never going to arrive, and Nick understands that, but Gatsby certainly doesn't. But Nick also understands that it's completely futile telling Gatsby that what he's hoping for is never going to happen, because Gatsby will always have this hope that Daisy and him are going to get back together, and he can't dispel that. There's no way that he can actually knock sense into Gatsby. So perhaps it links to the romantic readiness for hope in the first chapter. He's never going to give up. But again, there's something tragic in that.